Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive Hobbycast. Daniel here. I hope you are doing well, and if you're not, I hope you are soon. Okay, fall is definitely in the air here in the Pacific Northwest. It's getting much cooler in the mornings, and I am really enjoying it. I am ready for fall. I am ready for the return of rain. I cannot wait. Yeah, it's a nice, crisp, cool, kind of fallish morning here, and so let's talk about some board games. The topic for this episode is going to be my least favorite things about dungeon crawl and adventure board games. I don't typically do a lot of negative content, but I don't really consider this to be too much of a negative episode. I'm not using this as an excuse to just bash on my least favorite games. There will be a little bit of that, but not too much. Some of my favorite games do have these issues. Some of these are issues that only I have. Some of these are things that other people actually search out for. And so this is just a personal list, a kind of a top 10 things that I don't like about many of the games that I love. So we're going to go through my top 10. And then we're also going to do a little bit of a crowdsourcing some answers from Dungeon Dive patrons. So let's get right to it. Okay, at number 10. Number 10 is when a game is a table hog without needing to be one. And I think the best example I can think of right now for that is Bardsung. Bardsung, what a weird game that is. When the Kickstarter was going, they kind of touted that the game was super easy to set up and tear down, that it would offer a big experience with little overhead. And I don't think the game ended up that way. The board that you play on actually will not even fit on my dining room table. It is the biggest board I have ever seen for a game. It's a weird size. The image on the board looks really low res. I can't help but feel that they made a mistake and the board was supposed to be smaller, but they didn't catch the error until after all of the boards were made. I don't know. The board is almost unneeded for most of the game, except for when you do a boss fight, you have to flip the board over to this other weird configuration. I don't know. It is so weird. It's such a frustrating thing because that game it doesn't need a board for one thing. They could have come up with other ways to solve this issue. There's a lot of wasted space on the board, yet for certain little things, you kind of do need it. Just really poorly designed, but yeah. I understand that some games do need to be table hogs. Some games like Kingdom Death Monster or Arkham Horror with expansions, Shadows of Brimstone, but those games feel like they are using their table space wisely, and it makes the game better. But sometimes games are table hogs without needing to be a table hog, and that's when I have an issue. Okay, at number 9, this was a very, very common kind of negative comment I had about most of the games in my top 50. When I made my top 50, I tried to think of at least one piece of criticism about each game. And this was probably the number one criticism for all of the games that I like to play, or many of the games I like to play, I should say. And that is when a game is too long for what it has to offer. You know, games like Talisman, Roombound, Escape from Dulce, many others, they're just too long. You know, a nice tight adventure game doesn't need to be 2.5 to 3 hours long, especially when it doesn't really offer a reciprocating epic experience. And that is an issue. And that is an issue that I hear from a lot of people who only dabble in these kinds of games. You know, they say they would play more if the games were shorter. And oftentimes these games can go like 3 hours, over 3 hours long, and they just don't need to be that long. And as a game gets played more and more, these kinds of games, a typical set of house rules that people come up with are usually ways to make the games shorter. My house rules that I play Talisman with make the game shorter. Runebound. There's a whole set of rules for like faster runebound, and it makes the game better. And so when that happens, I think designers need to step back and think, okay, how can we make our games shorter so we can just play them more and play them more often? Okay, number eight is when games throttle my fun too much. When games don't allow me to engage with everything they have to offer on my terms. And I think the best example for that was Secrets of the Lost Station, and how it was kind of like the exact opposite of Secrets of the Lost Tomb. Or Secrets of the Lost Tomb, there was no throttle. You could have a crazy first turn where all kinds of stuff could happen. You could gain all kinds of allies and crazy weapons. And then you go into the follow-up Secrets of the Lost Station, and your first few games are throttled. For hours, the game throttles what you have access to in the game that you already purchased. I really enjoy games where I can just throw everything that I have in the game box onto the table and have this kind of crazy, super ultra, like wild experience. And so personally, I don't like when the game is in charge, when the game governs and drip feeds me little elements, and like I just want to get to the good stuff. And so that's what I appreciate about games. Number seven is one that adds a lot of time to a game often, and that is when a game has too many tiles to set up, too many tiles to dig through the box while you are playing the game to find a setup. And I think the king of this problem is one of my favorite games, and that is Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition. I would actually play this game more if it had fewer tiles. I think I would actually play this game more frequently if it had fewer tiles. There are so many tiles in that game to search through, and it does bog down the gameplay, the momentum of the narrative of the game. And I really do think it is an issue. And especially when the tiles, they're not needed. You know, we don't need 4 or 5 different interior hallways. We don't need 4 or 5 different studies or little outdoor areas. Make the tiles interesting. Give us a good number. There is this kind of magic number, right? And I'm not sure what that is. I'm not a game designer, but I am a game player, and I know when something bothers me as a game player. And so when that does, it's just, I think about it a lot. So number 7, too many tiles. Number 6 kind of piggybacks on top of that, and that is when the components make a game harder to play. I think a good example of this is the board in Dungeon Degenerate's Hand of Doom. It looks beautiful. I love it, but it can be a real pain in the butt to know what's a road, what's a path, what's a space. That is a great example of form over function. It doesn't work. You have to have kind of like an auxiliary map that just details the mechanical qualities of the board to look at while you are playing the game. Bardsung, another one. The size of the board makes the game harder to play. I felt the same way about Chronicles of Druganor, the 3D rooms. To me, they didn't really add anything, but they added a lot of setup time and a lot of storage issues. And also, I think like the dry erase boards in Hexplore It, as a lefty, I'm constantly smearing those things. I understand why they are in Hexplore It, because you are changing a lot of that information a lot. And if it was on paper, you'd have to be erasing a lot. And so it makes some sense, but it also is a little messy. And it's hard to, it is kind of hard to keep up from turn to turn. So that was number 6, when components make the game harder to play. Number 5 is when the focus is almost purely on combat. And this is a lot of games. Bag of Dungeon, A Zombicide, Vampire Hunters, a lot of cool mini or not games, a lot of Kickstarter games, these kind of like big dungeon crawls. It seems like you get everything set up, and then while you're playing, you realize all you are doing, the only verb you are doing is fight. There are other verbs. There are other ways to allow characters and to allow players to interact with game worlds. So that's one thing why I am always a huge a champion of non-combat encounters, of stat tests, things like in Forbidden Forge, or Shadows of Brimstone and Warhammer Quest, Hexplorit. These games that offer other things to do besides hit something. And combat can get really tiresome. A lot of these games don't have interesting combat. You just kind of like push your figures together and roll dice. I love rolling dice, but when that's all there is to do with those dice is roll them to attack, it does get a little tiresome. And I just want to experience more of the world. And I think a tangent to this one is when the game is focused solely on the dungeon, the corridors. I prefer when a game is a little more open, allowing my characters and allowing me to experience a world outside of the dungeons, giving me more to do in the game. Okay, number 4 is campaigns that are too long, too much padding. I think for this, I felt that way while I was playing Gloomhaven and while I was playing Madara. I typically don't like campaigns, but if there is a campaign, I like it to be on the shorter side, and I want it to have me, I want it to leave me wanting more. Sleeping Gods, I think, is a perfect length campaign, because I've already played through that multiple times. When I was done with my first time through that campaign, I instantly started it again, and I love that kind of campaign. I also don't mind a character-driven campaign. I survive what I call now survival campaigns, where my whole goal is for my character to survive from game to game, getting stronger, getting more loot, getting more powers, so I can face stronger and stronger challenges. And so I'm kind of in control of how long that campaign is. But when it's just a narrative campaign and it's too long, it kind of goes back to when a game is too long for what it has to offer. Give me something short and sweet that I want to experience multiple times. Number 3 piggybacks off of number 4, and that is poorly written campaigns. And there are 2 main ways that something can be poorly written from my perspective. One way is in the prose style, just the word choice, the syntax, the strength of the writing, and the other is in a narrative disconnect, and that is what I am reading of about my characters does not really reflect what I'm doing in the game. I think an example of something being kind of poorly written is Stars of Ikarios. When I was learning that game, throughout the time I spent with it, the reading was a real chore. It was quite amateurish. There was a lot of it, and it was not interesting, and the sentence structure was very clunky. The dialogue was way too on the nose. It wasn't well written. I read a lot of science fiction novels, and if I picked up a science fiction novel that was at that caliber, I would put it down. And when you are asking your game player, when you are asking your customers to read a few hundred pages of your prose, it needs to be at least, a certain quality. As far as a narrative disconnect, I also felt that the quality in Chronicles of Dragonor was also lacking. I was not interested in that at all. As far as a narrative disconnect goes, I think Madara is an example of that, because the characters in the story are very well written, and the Madara campaign is actually well written. The prose is good. It has a good style, but the characters are so concretely defined that it pulls me out of the gameplay, because they do things and they say things that I wouldn't do. And Madara is kind of this, RPG in a box. You are playing a character, but I never felt like the character was mine. I felt like I was controlling a character that was already written. And so it kind of forced me to think of my character in a certain way. And like when I was playing the game, maybe I don't think my character would do certain things, or when I was outside of the game reading, the characters would respond in ways that I didn't like. And so it never felt like I was part of the game. I felt like I was a third party witness to something that was already happening. And when I am investing in a game, I like to be in control of what is happening. And let's see, number two is dozens, or maybe in this day and age, hundreds of unnecessary miniatures. This is basically all CMON games or games like Deep Madness or Vampire Hunters. A lot of these Kickstarter and crowdfunding games just pile on the minis, and they just become completely unnecessary. In so many of these games, the minis aren't even used for any kind of tactical positioning, facing, backstabbing, or anything. They are only there to show where you are on the map. And they take a ton of space to store. They don't look attractive because I'm not a painter. You know, I can paint, but I don't have the time to paint. It's my least favorite part of this hobby is the whole modeling aspect of it. And nowadays, when I see nothing will turn me off from a crowdfunding campaign faster than hundreds of minis spread across multiple boxes. I will not back games like that anymore. I have a few more coming from over the past few years of backing things, but going forward, it's going to have to be a really special game to get me to buy into a ton of plastic. And number one, my absolute least favorite thing about these kinds of board games is when I turn the back of the box over and it says over 300 tokens, hundreds of chits, over 250 chits. Yeah, I don't like, just so many chits. When I see that, I think, okay, this is going to take me a ton of time to punch. I'm going to have to get really creative with my storage solutions. I'm going to have to go to the box store, go into Amazon and buy some Plano boxes, and then having to remember what all the chits do. It's kind of a bonus when the chits are large enough to have their rules printed on them, and they don't. That is a huge thing. Then there are also games like Shadows of Brimstone that come with hundreds of chits that are never even used. I have multiple Plano boxes storing chits from Shadows of Brimstone, and those chits are not even used. As a matter of fact, in the books, they even say that these are provided for your house ruling or for future content. And I don't think I've ever seen them go back and create future content for the chits that they made. Dungeon Crusade, a game that I do like. Both of these games, Shadows of Brimstone and Dungeon Crusade, are games that I like a lot. Dungeon Crusade has so many chits in the quest system, and it really does take a lot of time to sort through them and set up your quests because of how many chits it uses. At least Dungeon Crusade, on the chits that have rules, it does have the rule, like how much you heal for on the back of the chit. That's really good. Folklore the Affliction is great for that. It has a pretty good amount of tokens, but each token has the rules printed on it. I really do enjoy that. So if you are going to have a ton of chits, please, on one side of the chit, please put what that token does so we don't have to reference a rule book. So yeah, so that was the 10 things, my 10 least favorite things about dungeon crawl and adventure board games. A table hog without needing to be one. The game is too long for what it offers. When a game throttles my fun too much. Too many tiles. When the components make the game harder to play. When the focus is on combat in the dungeon and nothing outside of the dungeon. Campaigns that are too long with too much padding. Poorly written campaigns as far as prose style and narrative disconnect. Dozens/hundreds of unnecessary miniatures, and hundreds of chits and tokens. So now let's read a little bit. Here's just some quick hits from the Dungeon Dive Patreon and some of the crowd-sourced complaints here. So from Turhan, he says rules, poorly written rules and expansion bloat. Yeah, expansion bloat, definitely. That is like kind of a crowdfunding thing. And I mentioned that, and poorly written rules that can really kill a game. Brian says crazy setup and teardown time. Definitely, especially if you don't have multiple tables. That is, that for me, that kind of killed my love for Core Space, a game that I think is a fantastic game, but I could not play it because it took so long to tear down and so long to set up. Eventually, if I ever have a bigger hobby room, I will rebuy Core Space. Dan says, fiddliness, too many tokens and modifiers to track that I'll no doubt forget. Yeah, totally. Even though Folklore the Affliction handles its tokens really well, that game has so many modifiers to keep track of, and it's super easy to forget, so I can totally see that. Sung Hyun says that Dungeon Crawls have a tendency to have messier rulebooks, and not sure why they are so badly written. I think this is true, and I think you could probably narrow that down to crowdfunding and Kickstarter games, where they don't spend the money on the documentation. They spend the money on the stuff, and the documentation needs to be first and foremost when they're planning out their budgets. That is for sure. Andy says, very few Dungeon Crawl Adventure type games feel tactically or strategically rich enough. And I agree with this. I think that has to do, I could piggyback off of my combat complaint, where just the things aren't interesting. The verbs aren't interesting to execute. And that it totally is an issue. And so I would rather see that kind of stuff either more abstracted or make it more tactically and strategically interesting. Blue Botic says, my least favorite thing about Dungeon Crawl adventure games is the lack of an actual adventure / exploration mechanics, along with too much combat and too much grind. Totally, I mentioned that. Those two things above, I completely agree with that. Lou says, not enough interesting events and choices that don't rely on combat to resolve. This seems to be a common thing with viewers of the Dungeon Dive. We've built this community of people who like other things to do in games except for hit things and shoot things. Genghis Pawn says, there's often a mismatch between game coherence and narrative coherence. The progression of the game through phases and rounds up to the end game often doesn't track with the progression of the narrative. I think what he's touching on here is something that I touched on above in my poorly written campaigns, where we have this kind of ludonarrative dissonance, where what you are doing in the game doesn't match the narrative. And I completely agree with that. And that is a really hard thing to get right. Tom says, assembling and painting minis. Yep, 100% there with you. I still have not played Warhammer Quest Cursed City because I have not put together the minis. Unnecessary, complicated, overwrought, and unintuitive combat mechanisms. I can see that, that striking that balance between having something be strategically and tactically interesting, like Andy wants, but also having it have a nice flow and that is easy to get into. That's a really, really hard thing. And Tom also says a Kickstarter bloat. 100% agree. Hopefully with like shipping costs and hopefully with things becoming more expensive, maybe we will see less bloat. I really hope we do. Max says too many minis and long campaigns. Agree. Again, I think this specific thing is kind of a specific quirk of an idiosyncrasy of viewers of the Dungeon Dive, of our community. We tend to like a certain type of game, at least a large portion of us. There are people who like our community and the Dungeon Dive who love these kind of big mini campaigns, and that's great. It's good to have options. And Richard says, searching a rulebook for a specific rule, which is why I like the Fantasy Flight rulebooks. Setup time can be a pain, but it's part and parcel of games I like best, so I accept it. So yeah, I think I do really enjoy those Fantasy Flight rulebooks where they split. They have a how to play book, and then they have a book where the rules are in alphabetical order. And I do like that. It's like an expanded index, an expanded glossary. The Ghost Betwixt has a fantastic index where not only does it have all of your things that you would look for, but it has a little mini description of the rule and the page number that the rule can be found in the book. Great, fantastic index. Trying to find the right mini out of a big Kickstarter batch can be a pain. I agree, Richard, especially with a game like Deep Madness, where like 90% of the enemies are some kind of two-legged tentacle beast, and they all look the same, and the art is so dark on the cards that it's almost impossible to tell them apart. That is a huge negative for me as well. So, all right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed this topic. Again, I didn't want to be too negative. These are just some criticisms I have, and I didn't want to bash on games that I don't like because I wanted to present that these are issues even in games that I love. So, well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. We will talk to you later. Bye bye.